and welcome to our blog. And I am with Alex Strekal today, blogger. Well, excuse me, Substack newsletter writer, which is a fancy way of just saying we finally figured out how to monetize blogging.
Pretty much.
So we're here to talk about the Bernie diaspora, the post-Bernie malaise, where the anarchists ended up, where the Marxists ended up, and why everything feels so shit right now. And we're doing it just so people know the context, even though this will be coming out probably in January, February of 2025. We're doing it the night of the election. And we're not going to talk much about the election because I have nothing good to say about it whatsoever. But it is sort of a backdrop to how we found ourselves with our options being such shit, where we're hoping at the last minute to prop up the Green Party again for the time that it's likely to not hit 5%.
Yeah, and it is relevant, of course, to the election, but it's the back history that we're talking about more that led us where we are, essentially.
Yeah, so we were going to talk more about this in our first episode on the specter of alternative politics, but I wanted to sort of get to what you think went on with the Bernie movement around some of these groups we talked about in our first episode, which people should look up. Between Bernie 1 in 2016 and Bernie 2 in 2020, and then the great fragmenting of the Bernie diaspora. So I'm just gonna prompt you with that.
Okay.
How does Bernie play such a key role in both consolidating and dispersing these movements?
Well, that's certainly a good question. I mean, I remember when he first got popular, and as I previously stated, it was similar to Ron Paul in the sense that he was considered almost like the one guy saying things other people wouldn't and sort of calling out the establishment in certain ways, if you will. And he definitely had more momentum the first time around, in my perception. The second, he obviously got kneecapped both times in one way or another. And I especially have observed, yeah, there are certain ways in which people who are on board with Bernie, then, as you call it, the diaspora, right? Certain people's brains broke and they went in various directions since he obviously didn't win. And that includes the whole Jimmy Dore camp as well, of sort of crossover populist thing in which coming from Bernie supporters who didn't know what to do after he lost and have a lot of legitimate critiques of the Democrats, actually. But there's this camp that I observe that their bitterness from Bernie led them to almost tail the right, or if not tail the right, almost be such cynics that like their whole politics is nothing but being anti-democrat in a way. And they don't really have an answer.
Well, to be fair to Dore, his anti-democratic stance, and by that I mean anti-democratic party stance, is not new. That he was a Bernie campaigner in 2016, but that was about as much as he wanted to mess with the Democrats. But his talking points definitely changed after 2021.
Yes. I get what you're saying.
Doing plausible deniability on COVID conspiracies, getting a lot more right-wing guests on his show.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. We've definitely seen that.
Maybe bringing him up wasn't the best example of my point in a way, but I also see this coming from a lot of the Green camp in a way, where it's like people who are, for pretty legit reasons, pretty cynical about the Democrats, but their online posting, from what I see, is literally just, yeah, they're like Jill Stein supporters who just kind of agitate their desperation with the Democrats and don't have an answer. Or obsessively talk about the foreign policy, especially. And it almost seems like they just stew in this nihilistic bitterness towards the Democrats, but don't really have an answer, other than to just fall back on the Greens or something.
Right. But then when you ask them if they really think it's a solution, they'll tell you that all they're aiming to do is break the two-party duopoly by getting the Greens to 5% so they can get federal funding. To which I always ask, then what's the point then? Like, if you know it's not going to, I guess if you want to punish Harris, it's a way to punish Harris without saying you endorse Trump. But it's not something that I see giving a whole lot of ways out of the current scenario, because it still is primary. Like, if we look at the Jill Stein, look, in 2020, the Greens were running a co-presidential candidate with the Socialist Party of the United States, Howie Hawkins. Today, they're running Jill Stein, and that feels like a repeat deliberately of a prior failed strategy. Now, the vice presidential candidate has a better relationship with the Muslim community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And about, a little under 50% of the Muslim voters that have been polled say they're going to vote for the Greens, but that still doesn't get them the 5%.
That's right.
They might hit it. But we haven't seen a third-party candidate hit 5% since Ross Perot. And I question what they're going to do with it, because I don't know that the Greens have very much state-level game in a lot of the country. So again, this feels like a presidential stunt dodge in a way similar to my critique of the Bernie movement, where the Bernie movement was like, we're going to use this electoral power to empower the workers' movement, but we need the workers' movement to win.
That's right.
This feels like we need to run a Hail Mary pass dissent from the Democrats campaign with the Greens that literally nobody was considering a year ago. I mean, like, when people were going through their third party options around Biden, the Greens weren't coming up. You were getting RFK, you were getting Cornel West, you were getting the People's Party around Jimmy Dore. None of that ended up coalescing at all. So we ended up back in the spot that we were before Bernie. That's what I'm actually fascinated with, because, like, if we think about Jill Stein's presidential ones, like, she is, 74, so she's not particularly long, doesn't really undo that. She's ran for the presidency in 2012, 2016, and 2024. And she was blamed for almost costing Obama the election in 2012, and she was blamed for costing Hillary Clinton the election in 2016, which was kind of a joke. I mean, because obviously Stein's popularity is actually dependent on the negative viewpoints of the main Democratic candidate.
Very true.
So,
I guess from what I see, it's just the Jill Stein thing and the Green Party in general. It just amounts to a protest vote that's supposed to be symbolic or whatever, or at least send a statement, but it doesn't really do anything. At the end of it, that's kind of how I feel about the third parties that do have, libertarians and the Greens at this point are just like, I'm not into the whole angle of obviously like finger wagging at the third parties for spoiling elections or whatever. I think that just takes the status quo for granted too much in a way. But I do think that it is just by the sheer numbers, it's an untenable thing, and it ends up just being a symbolic vote, channeling yourself into a false alternative that will never have national power at any real level.
Right. I mean, I could go into the history of the Greens, Howie Hawkins and John Riesenbrink's relationship and founding it, Peter Comejo's relationship and really helping Hawkins and Riesenbrink do that. Its tie to Nader, the weird right populist, left populist unity ticket that happened under Nader when the Reform Party and the Green Party threw their support behind Nader one year. I believe it was 96.
Yeah.
So, which also I just want to point out didn't give them over 5%, despite the
Of
fact
course.
that the Reform Party, no, it wasn't 96, it was 2004. So it was after the Pat Buchanan Reform Party, but before it seemed to just fade out as an independent institution. Now that I'm remembering correct. So I find this interesting, but I also find it interesting that we're still dealing with baby boomer relics in all these parties. But it also feels like this is the same protest vote you would have cast in 2012.
Probably. Yeah, you're right. Nothing's changed
Almost
in that regard.
identically. Like
Um,
it's not like it's like we're dealing with the same candidate, we're dealing with the same platform for the most part. I'm sure there's been some additions to the platform, but not many. And I'm not here to belittle anyone for wanting the protest vote. I couldn't make myself vote for either major party candidate either. But it seems to be that it really isn't a solution. It seems to be like a way to punish the Democrats. Fine, and that is a political strategy. But with no viable way to build up a movement
yeah.
to replace the Democrats. And to me, it's not that different from the same delusions you saw with like the Ackerman plan, except that was trying to do the same thing within the Democratic Party.
Yeah. I don't know. And there's also the opposite dynamic, as we've much discussed, of the people who, like, in the past were very cynical of the Democrats. Bernie for former people who probably millennials, especially, who joined the left during the Bernie wave, who like um, initially make a lot of like cynical statements towards liberals, and you would think that they're posturing very hard left. And then once this election came, got very soft and started like buying into the vibes rhetoric and just making very reaching justifications for supporting Harris's campaign all of a sudden. And I found that to be weird in and of itself too.
I saw
To watch.
one of the caucuses that we're talking about tied to the Bernie Sanders campaign try to claim that if Harris wins, it was a victory for the pro-Palestine Democratic Party adjacent DSA,
Huh.
because they're trying to claim that they were the main reason that Harris got on. I mean that Harris got on the ticket and Biden got unseated,
Yeah.
which is frankly delusional. Like
Yeah.
Biden got unseated because there's a defection amongst the donor class, not because of anything 60K people in the DSA may have thought. Right.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. Yeah, you thought that. Yeah, they thought that they had some grander effect than they really did, as if they're
Yeah.
like the Democratic Party specifically responding to them, and it really isn't mostly.
Uh, but yeah, so you have the Door phenomenon, which I think, we have to give Door some credit that he was right that the Dems were cynically using the squad and Bernie to stir up momentum. And there was I don't know if it was intentional. In fact, I don't think it was initially, but it seems to be that Bernie was so afraid of getting put in history as the same kind of person as Jill Stein
Hmm.
that he was willing to kiss the ring early and often.
Well, that's the other
Um,
confusing thing, and which of course Jimmy Dore's commentary is relevant to because he's always calling it out. But yeah, just how much Bernie has kissed the ring, and but also how much as a follower of him, and that's where like I feel so different from a lot of standard leftists, I guess, who like they have a prehistory of following the Democratic Party and voting for Democrats in a way that I do not. So I think they have this attachment where like they're more likely to just if Bernie says vote for Hillary Clinton, they'll vote for Hillary Clinton, like because
mhm.
they still follow him as well. That's the pragmatic political wisdom, right? and he's someone they trust. So it turns into this weird thing where people who would posture themselves as hard left end up being just liberals, quote unquote, at the end of the day, because of Bernie kissing the ring and like being this sort of thing people hinge on to like fall back on, I guess. Like, well, if that's what the
Right.
official position is, I'm going to have to fall in line.
I mean, to me, it became really obvious when you looked at not just something like Dorr, because Dorr has his fans, and like I said, Dorr even I think both you and I would even say, as much as we are annoyed with some of the stunts Dorr's pulled, his main points about the squad and the Democrats,
they're not wrong,
has held. It's just that what he wants to replace them with is, I actually have no fucking idea, some kind of populist vibe.
Well, the other thing that's a
that
little bothersome about Dora is just like he's just not politically astute enough to like know who the fuck he's talking about part of the time, and part of the controversy around him is it's a bit like a Joe Rogan type of scenario where it's like it's not necessarily that he endorses reactionaries or something, but like he brings them on and like he has no idea who the fuck he's talking to, and he just like softballs them because he doesn't even fucking know what's going on. And it's just because of this vague populist mishmash that he's seeking with whoever is considered an outsider, basically. And it turns into in a way, it mirrors the libertarian fusionism, which was its own version of left-right populism at the end of the day. Anyway, he ends up almost sounding like,
well, that's what I was going to ask you about. Like,
is this a repeat of libertarian strategy? Like,
I mean, well, we look at someone like Jackson Hinkle, right? Who was a Bernie bro way back in the day. Now he's like some kind of socially conservative communist or anti-imperialist. I use both those in quotes. But Hinkle was created by the Bernie movement. And he seems to have this idea that you can build up a left-wing populism and a right-wing populism together, largely off of foreign policy. But it's hard to tell if it's organic at all. But the first thing I learned about Hinkle, even though he has millions of followers on Twitter, which who knows if they're organic or not, is that he was kind of, a person not running on a red-brown strategy, but running on something like joint populist anti-imperialism, which you and I recognize from the libertarian campaign in the aughts.
Yes,
which
and
is
there
this
is some
idea of the
overlap.
anti-war liberals.
There is some legit
Some of the same people are
there.
involved, even.
Like the motivations are different, but like I've observed a while back that there's. I mean, it kind of relates to what we talked about in the last video. There's an overlap between the paleo-conservative and libertarian camps and left-wing anti-imperialism. But the right-wing, it's not that they're anti-imperialist really, but it ends up overlapping because of the anti-war sort of sentiments that go along with it. I mean, so there is like a natural reason for that at some level, but it ends up getting vagued up, I guess. But yeah, and that goes back to it's just that the motivations are different. Like it's more isolationist when it's coming from the paleo libertarian type of people.
Right. I mean, I will say that isolationism is also something that like almost no one actually believes in, including.
Well, it's kind of a loaded. It is kind of a loaded old term.
Yeah. But I actually think you're right in that we've seen a ton of this stuff move towards the post-left. And in many ways, the post-left, a lot of them over time just become right-wing populists, whatever that means.
Whatever that means, yeah.
Right. Because that's a floating signifier too, right? Like what the issues are, what they're reading onto, like the Make America Great Again movement, etc., seems to be, opportunistic in a way that flatters them. But we can't be too mad at them in a way, because we have to acknowledge that a lot of people did that with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to a lot of our, not great success. I mean, if we think about the number of people who in 2019 who were telling me by 2028 we'd see President Ocasio-Cortez, I just like stare at them blankly now.
Mm.
Like, and it was, and even at the time I thought it was transparently ridiculous that these people were like not really like they couldn't see in the past and they also couldn't see into the future, and thus they don't know how this rhymes with the past. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the one thing we can say about this current moment is that the libertarians kind of went away. Like we mentioned in the last one, they either became nationalists or they became liberals for the most part.
Well, I agree with you, but I would want to clarify. I mean, it's like the party is still there, the movement's still there, but yes, there was a subsection of them that effectively got subsumed into Trumpism, and a subsection of them actually kind of got subsumed into the liberal Democrats. Actually, that's less known or talked about. But there's this camp of people who they originally called themselves neoliberals, actually, but then they rebranded as new liberals, for example. But it's mostly coming from socially liberal libertarians who disagree with the paleo types, who ended up moving into the Democratic Party, and like they might favor minor regulations on capitalism or something, but otherwise they're pretty like big YIMBY development types.
Right. I mean, like,
Um,
like those people in New York who are entering the DSA en masse.
yeah.
uh, so yeah, I think that's.
But I do think the movement's still there. But yes, it's never going to like get much more than a marginal effect. And the Libertarian Party does still run what I call, yeah, they're the milquetoast, socially liberal, fiscal conservative type of libertarian. But it's obviously the party's been around for 50 years or something, and it kind of has a weird astroturfed history too. um, and it mostly has ended up serving as an organ of the Republicans anyway.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's always been kind of astroturfed. It's what I find fascinating is even though it's actually had more state level representatives than a lot of these other third parties, that it's also not usually gotten more than 2% of the vote.
That's right.
Which I find fascinating. I mean, so we've talked about this in our last thing about the spectrum of alternative politics, but we have to ask ourselves like a question. So, for example, the Muslim population in the United States is about 2% of the population. Jill Stein is likely to win about half of that. Where's the other 4% going to come from? A bunch of disaffected leftists? I guarantee you there are less disaffected far leftists in America than there are Muslims. So
Probably.
you're not, yeah. So now that is enough that the Democrats can gear up to blame like defections of black men and all this other stuff, and the left and Jill Stein for if Hillary loses. But to me, we have to ask ourselves, why did we allow ourselves to be fooled that the Democrats were ever going to allow a Corbyn-like situation to happen with Bernie Sanders in the
Yeah.
Democratic Party? And we also have to remind ourselves that Corbyn lost twice.
So it's the same.
And now the left in the UK seems to be non-existent. It's just gone. So, I mean, there are workers' movements in the UK, but the left, the formalized left, seems to just have been liquidated. So when we look at where we're heading in, it also seems like that there was kind of a deal with the devil that the DSA made with the Democrats by wedding us to them again, and then not opposing or breaking when Trump lost.
Well, yeah, this is sort of the pattern I've observed with a lot of the millennial leftists who followed Bernie. Is like,
mm.
yeah, they come into it almost as like quasi tankies or something in their rhetoric, very radical posture, and then at the end of the day, they start these very same people who posture almost as if they're tankies or something, end up being just kind of like the most liberal version of the most conventional liberal version of socialism possible in their arguments. They turn into liberal pragmatists.
What do you mean by tanky? Because that is an abused term.
Well, it is a very abused term, and I've commented on that before. But people who posture as like they have Soviet insignia everywhere, and
Right.
they're um very keen on Russia and China or whatever.
It reminds me of the CPUSA from the late 70s into like the aughts. So that's the Communist Party of the United States, which is a historical Comintern aligned party.
But I want to
Who's
be clear
also
about
full of feds. Go ahead.
of course, but that's something that I've talked about a bit. Is tanky has become a very abused term, especially in the last 5 years, and I actually noticed it's gotten to a point where like liberals have picked up the term tanky, and like they're calling anarchists tankies even. Like they think anyone who's like a foreign policy critic is a tanky at this point. Like it has no meaning in
Right.
some of these discourses I'm seeing. It's like a
So,
tanky used to be something pretty damn specific, and now it's like anyone
well, let's
who's
talk about what it is. Like tanky is someone who supported Khrushchev crushing the Prague Spring
right.
and
If you want to
the
get
Hungarian
super
uprising.
specific with it, and its
I mean, that is
originating,
the
yeah,
origins.
yes,
And then sometimes it means Marxist Leninist, but again, you're not using it even that specifically because the people we're talking about have the foreign policy stances of Marxist Leninist, and they'll even sound almost like third worldist in some of their rhetoric, but their actual politics is wedded to the Democratic Party.
that's kind of what I'm
Uh,
talking about in a way. Yes, but their posture might make them sound like third worldists. Basically, they have a very that kind of bent a lot. But then at the end of the day, yeah, they're still wedded to liberal pragmatist thought with the Democratic Party.
right. I
Um,
mean, it's the kind of people I think of who, and a lot of them are in the DSA, who got mad when Palestinians were protesting Jamal Bowman, but then made the exact same arguments that the Palestinians were making against Jamal Bowman against Biden and Harris,
yeah,
even though they also want us to stay working within the Democratic Party.
sure. But
So it's just,
just
and that's a common position. So
But I would just call it like the way I would generally use the term tanky is like, yeah, someone who like cosplays it up a lot with Soviet iconography, has pictures of Mao everywhere, and it is very like most likely engages perhaps even some of the fourth positionism crap or whatever, um or multipolarity type of stuff. That's how I
yeah,
would generally use the term.
I mean,
Um
the multipolarity stuff is confusing, and it makes me mad because I get called all kinds of names by people who are clearly projecting what they want onto the history of the term.
And
Um,
I've been accused of being a tanky by anarchists who don't know what the fuck they're talking about before.
right. And well,
Um,
it's a term of abuse, which is why I asked you to clarify it. I actually don't use the
um,
term.
that's
I
what I
don't
think.
use it at all.
Okay,
So, because it's been ruined by overuse, it's
yeah,
unclear. Um,
like it got to a point where like you could literally call a paleoconservative a tanky in the way people are using it, and that's where
right.
it got weird. That's where it got weird for me, and I made some observations about that. The breakdown of the term, and I noticed this in Vauch's community especially because he started throwing the word tanky, or his audience started picked up on the term, and then you read his comment section, and it's like, oh Jesus, like this this is totally inapplicable.
Right.
It's just a liberal smear term against a foreign policy critic at this point. So it's like okay, whatever tanky means.
But I mean, I do think there to get beyond the use of the term tanky. I just wanted to be clear
Sure.
about that. There is a tendency on the American left for people to take radical positions on foreign policy and milquetoast positions on domestic policy. There's
Mm,
a long history of that.
mm, mm.
Um, And one of the reasons why I think they do that, to be quite frank, is they have no effect on foreign policy. So there's no cost to making those calls.
Sure.
None. Now I think Palestine complicates that because there has been a cost to that. There has been, people who got used to institutions allowing you to do massive protest and write annoying letters to the editor that it normally break company policy actually got cracked down on and lost their jobs over Palestine. But
Okay.
that really happened. But
Okay. It's something.
but I would also say, a lot of the people who throw that around, I mean, I am specifically thinking of like the non-Matt Christman part of Chapo Trap House, where they take very radical lines on foreign policy and very milquetoast lines as for a leftist on domestic policy, and ignore the fact that they're also often supporting people who do not share their foreign policy agenda at all.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I felt that way somewhat about Jacobin's output in general. Maybe not so much in terms of the foreign policy being radical, but in terms of like, okay, you're just kind of advocating corporate liberalism from the 50s and 60s and returning to that. Like
right.
it didn't.
It's
Um,
socialism for them is New Deal Fordism, but with the workers slightly more in charge this time.
yes. Well,
But
well, simultaneously, very strongly arguing against like anything that's anarchisty. That and while I might agree with some of those critiques, it almost felt to me like, okay, you're also like positioning yourself as the de facto um what's the term I'm looking for? Yeah, as the de facto people who would be the managers, as a de facto managerial elite, while saying that you don't trust the workers themselves. And there's that aspect of it as well that rubs people wrong, I think. And kind of echoes Leninism in a way. Of that whole conundrum of I'm brain farting on the terminology. Um, but you know what I'm talking about. Where managerial elite socialism, if you will.
I mean, I think that's true of a lot of the analytical Marxists. To be frank, that they view this as a issue of specific developments and policies, and not of, say, empowering workers.
Yes.
I would actually say they're even more guilty of that than Lenin was. Like,
Okay.
we can talk about the Vanguard Party stuff, but like Lenin did have Soviets, and they did sort of matter. They
Okay.
mattered less and less if things went on, but they
But
actually did
yeah, these
matter.
people are talking like, yeah, there's gonna be no Soviets at all, and
Right.
it's us, the managerial elite, who is gonna create socialism.
I mean,
Um,
but this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about the Bernie diaspora, because these same people are the people who broke out and resurrected the 1960s and early 70s PMC category from
yes,
from
correct.
being fading to obscurity, as a kind of theodicy for why they failed in 2020. So, it was all
The
the fake
PMC.
workers, the PMC.
Yeah, and that gets very arbitrary because it's like I think there's an element of truth to the PMC thing, but I pretty much agree with your position that like it's not really a class, but you can consider it like a subcategory within the workers, and maybe, and I would emphasize it's even relevant. Yeah, just to consider it in terms of Liber aristocracy, I guess. And it's like, okay, yeah, you're onto something, but the way they talk about it, it's conflated with someone's political beliefs or not, or whether they're politically liberal. Uh,
Right, political
uh,
liberalism is seen as a PMC ideology, as
and it's
well as what
yep,
else would they link to it, as
that and they overemphasize its effect as a class. It's
well.
like
I mean,
yeah,
the thing is, what they mean by it is also a floating signifier. Sometimes they mean elites, and sometimes they mean anyone with a
yes,
college degree,
and then that's
which
where it
I
gets like it's like okay,
yeah.
so our college students or even professors or even doctors and lawyers like elites in a political sense that's very important. Like I don't think so.
Right.
Um,
I mean, Doctor, it's so that's a kind of weird conglomeration of things. And normally, what if you really push people about what their image of that is, it isn't managers or professionals, it's academics, right?
Yes,
And like media people. But
and that
like,
gets weird. Yeah.
because I'm like, well, okay, there is a lot there if we want to talk about the weird role of academics. But are you seriously trying to convince me that high school teachers and adjunct professors have the same social power as lawyers and tenure track professors, and they have the same social power as Ivy League graduates? And also, don't you realize you're talking about 40% of the population, and your idea
Right.
of who the working class is only 16% of the population?
Yes,
Like,
that's a concern that comes up for me in dealing with certain interpretations of Marxism. Actually, it's like, well, how strictly do you interpret the working class, and how egalitarian is your philosophy really if the working class is 5% of the population or something? Um,
right.
so
I mean, because usually when they say working class, most people mean wage earners.
yeah,
Then they move it to productive wage earners, and then they'll try to say that service sector people,
or
even
no,
when they produce a physical commodity,
mm,
such as coffee, which you consume on the spot, but it is a physical commodity and it is traded on the stock market, so it's a commodity. Um, Somehow aren't productive workers, even though they are producing capital surplus, just not at I just don't understand because they'll act like baristas are the same thing as like tech workers or government workers or something. It's
yeah,
bizarre.
it is bizarre.
Um,
I
and
I think some weird cultural bias has to come into that. But it's about
right.
who don't you like?
Well, it becomes clear that a lot of people want to blame certain groups for their failure to reach out to a larger audience in 2020, but they don't want to be like, we don't like these cultural people because because it would be clearly seen as reactionary. Also, it is.
Yeah.
And so you come up with this, well, the PMC like it. Well, who the fuck do you mean by the PMC? It becomes this floating signifier that controls everything and nothing.
Yeah.
Like, and I also point out that the only people who use the term would qualify as being in the class they're critiquing.
Yes, I've talked about that as well, and yeah, it's also it's almost comes off as like, is this just the competitive logic of professionals themselves?
Right. It's like, oh,
Um,
so I mean, I think we see that when you realize that a lot of what they want is their 1950s Fordism back, the same as the other DSA types. Uh which it makes sense that they would become more and more conservative over time then, because like
that's what I saw with Catherine Liu, following her a little more, she did seem to become almost socially conservative to a certain extent over time. Um, from what I saw, I could be off the mark there, but I've seen that with certain people from Jacobin too, where it's like maybe it was part of their pitch of trying to pander to right populism or something, but it's just like I don't know. Like I just don't buy this. Yes, you could appeal to. I understand the cultural bullshit is a problem, but at the same time, like I have this nagging idea that like it's a terrible idea to like try to appeal to working class people, but let them have like any fringe right wing idea they want. But as long as they support like some single issue thing like universal healthcare, they're part of some political alliance with you. It's like I just think that's insane. You have to actually bring them your way, or you're not really doing anything.
no, I
Um,
mean, if you allow them to move you, you're tailing them.
yes,
And also looking at what most working class Americans actually believe, it is true that blue collar people more and more vote for conservatives, and that's been true since the 1970s. But that's also true for many of the identitarian groups that people were saying we're always going to stay loyal to the Democrats.
it's true.
Um, which, if you in the long array of things, for example, black men supporting the Democrats at rates above 90% is actually something that was established only in Obama's first term.
Mm,
And since it was a one off thing, now black women have been a loyal Democratic Party bastion since the 70s. Black men in the North have been Democratic Party supporters at about 60 to 70% since the New Deal. However, that's not dealing with the fact that in the South, where a lot of black men are, felon laws prevent about 40% of them from voting.
There's that. That's a factor. And I have observed, actually, even in Cleveland here, like a lot of the younger black men in particular I know, either they're Trump supporters or they're like not necessarily Trump supporters, but certainly strongly socially conservative, actually. They're not archetypal liberals. Maybe their parents were more likely to be. And I've met those type of folks where like it makes sense because of the civil rights era that was sort of the incentive to support the Democrats. But I think
Yeah.
I've met a whole cross section of young black men who like, especially they felt that Obama did them wrong, actually, and then they've defected from the Democrats since then, actually. And some of them get tempted into being Trump supporters, actually, and it may surprise white liberals to hear just how popular he is among some black people, actually, black males. Just in my anecdotal experience.
Well, the stats
And the
both do
stats
and
seem to
don't bear
bear it
that
out.
out. Yeah, I
Oh,
mean they both
okay.
do and don't. Like you're still dealing with most young black men are still probably going to vote for Harris today.
Okay.
But a significant number of them aren't.
It's a growing number.
Right. But I also think that that's being used by the Democrats to hide the fact that they've been pivoting to chase college educated white female voters and blue collar women solely on abortion. And we'll know a lot by the time this comes out. This part of the conversation will have been clarified by history. But like,
True.
I mean, it just seems to me that people resurrecting PMC theory and ignoring what John and Barbara Ehrenreich had to say about it. Because John and Barbara Ehrenreich actually talked about, Barbara Ehrenreich before she died was talking about the PMC as a class that was dividing amongst itself between part of it that was being proletarianized and part of it that wasn't. And Christian Parenti actually developed that even more by pointing out that a lot of the profession, the reason why we had to talk about professionals is professionals used to largely be petit bourgeois. If you were a doctor, you own your own practice. That's not true now. The great majority of them are wage earners. They work for institutions. They're high paid wage earners, and they have certain relationships to the government, which means that they're protected from certain kinds of problems, but they're still like, again, I don't know who they're talking about when they talk about PMC. If we're trying to come up with one relationship to either the working class or to the mode of production, what we actually end up is like a group of people that seem to be categorized together because of the way that liberalism, particularly progressive liberalism, is seen as an ideology of the educated class today, which has not historically been true until the last 10 years. Like the idea that being college educated made you more likely to be a Democrat is something that Republicans have been saying since William Buckley in the 60s, but has not been statistically true until the aught teens. In the aught teens, it became a statistical reality, but not before then.
What do you think changed or caused that to be actualized?
I think the amount of academic adjacent activist terminology adopted into the party after Obama, particularly after 2012, and Occupy as a way to keep the progressives in the coalition probably prompted a lot of that.
Okay.
And that also there is a huge donor class tied into the endowment apparatus of major universities. And that also on top of all that, there are very few incentives for conservatives to remain in universities at all. And that's been true since the teens, that there have been ideological, not purges, that's not true, but like ideological, basically, self-deportation movements, for lack of a better metaphor, where like conservatives have just been made to feel unwelcome on campus, so they leave. And I think, that has pernicious effects that people don't think about, because it makes it seem like that being a educated person is to be a kind of namby-pamby liberal,
Is
in a
ideologically
way,
loaded.
right, in a way that has always been something that Republicans have been trying to sell the public. But because I heard that stereotype when I was a kid, but it wasn't true. It was a false stereotype. It's true now. If you go to like, conservatives will often get BAs, and in fact, interestingly, a BA or a BS is less of a predictor of being a liberal than it used to be. It's now you got to get a master's degree. But basically, nobody who gets a master's degree is not liberal or left wing. And a lot of it's even alienating to the far left. Like, I would have a hard time sitting through, the ideological indoctrination of some of those courses at this point in my life myself.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I mean, just speaking from personal experience, I attended college firstly for music. I technically didn't finish it because all of the English and math classes were staved off, and then I dropped out. I did good in the music classes, but a few years later, I actually went into a philosophy 101 class. And while I don't necessarily, I'm not like some sort of, reactionary anti-feminist or anything, but like on the first day of class, the guy like talks about feminism. Well, actually, he starts out talking about Socrates, and then he jumps to feminism. And we're talking about liberal feminist theory on day one of Philosophy 101 class. And I just found that strange. It's like, why are you bringing these politically loaded topics into it on day one when we were just talking about the Greeks? So I found that just to be an anecdotal example of how I could see how the culture environment at colleges also almost automatically is going to push certain people in certain directions because that's the topic du jour of the environment.
right.
Um,
I was actually recently dealing with a agricultural school, uh, major research institution, but it largely serves an agricultural population, and it largely does agricultural based majors in Utah, that was requiring all of its students to do like progressive racial analysis in Comp 101.
yeah, it just seemed
And it's just like,
arbitrarily
yeah.
forced. Yeah, it's like shoehorned in, is how I
Right,
felt about
and even
it.
the very left wing or liberal graduate students felt uncomfortable, because they're like, you're having me talk about this race stuff, and there's literally no one in this circuit who has any real experience with it at all. And
Yeah,
actually, a lot of what we get back is reactionary pablum that's prompted by what you're asking, instead of like trying to build up some trust and show it to you another
yeah.
way.
So maybe it backfires. Maybe the intent of it is, yeah, to educate people, quote unquote, and make them more socially liberal. But it ends up having the reverse effect. People feel alienated. They think you're shoehorning the topic in a way that doesn't make sense. And some, of course, some of the rhetoric pushes people away, and then the right becomes more reactionary and just doubles down.
Right.
Um,
I
basically,
have approached that in my own educational stuff in an entirely different way, where I try to limit things to facts, and I think the facts normally speak for themselves. But not that you can ever deal with facts purely without some theoretical framework, but I mean, like, I've gotten conservative people, without getting them to abandon their conservatism, to come to understand left and liberal points by not framing them as politically charged points and not using that language.
right.
Um, and a lot of these things have social codes where you kind of have to use the language, right?
And then
Like,
that automatically alienates. But yeah, it is
right,
kind of like it does become lingo, doesn't it?
right.
Um,
I'll give you an example of it just around here. even amongst my Democratic voting Latin friends in the neighborhood, you'll notice that I always say Latin and not Latino or Latina or Latinx, because I'm deliberately just translating a gendered word into Spanish to its degendered word in English. But Latinx alienates a lot of working class Latin people in my neighborhood.
Okay.
It does. It does. I'm not saying that there is no organic movement for Latin. There was a movement in Argentina, but it was very urban. It's much more complicated than it's just a white invention. But a lot of people in the Latin community here do perceive it as an educated white imposition on
I can
their own
believe that.
cultural identity.
I can believe
Right?
that.
Whether or not that's objectively true is a separate question. But to me, whenever I've said Latin, no one has gotten mad.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's they shouldn't. I mean, it's the most neutral way to go about it.
Right. Well, I mean, what you hear about people getting mad about it, but my trans friends appreciate that I'm not gendering it, and my Latin friends appreciate that I'm not trying to use a word that they feel is alienating.
Sure.
Like, however, in academia, I am sure someone would actually say something about me making that choice.
Yeah.
Like,
there's always going to be that person.
Well, there's a whole department. It's called the Rhet and Comp department. Their entire mode of being is if we change language, it will change material reality, and that's what they do. I mean, I don't want to generalize that to everyone in Rhet and composition, but it is the majority ideological apparatus than that.
So Derrida on crack.
Discipline. Yeah, sort of. I really want to talk about this. So, in the sense that you and I both feel like anarchism has gone in a really weird direction.
Yeah, I did want to talk about that. Yes, it has.
I mean, you watch Voss, which I've never been able to make myself do.
Well, to be clear, like, he pops up virally on my feed, and I occasionally check in. But yes, I watch. I hate watch him though.
I refuse to hate watch anyone unless I can shoot at them. No, I mean, in all seriousness,
but he's relevant to that. He's relevant to that, but yes.
Well, I mean, I've seen anarchism. So there's been one movement of the anarchists who want to go back to like anarchism of the early 20th century, late 19th century, who want to get back the tradition that was seemingly lost around like the CNT and in Spain and all that.
The way I categorize it in my head is there's historical anarchism, which was approximately, Proudhon up to what you're talking about, like the Spanish Revolution era. And then after that, like the window of classical, that's what I call classical or historical anarchism, and that window closes with World War I and World War II, especially. And then after that, you sort of get a revived anarchism within the New Left. And then in the 90s, you get the post-left thing. That's kind of how I split it up in my head.
Right. Well, the problem that I have with that is Graeberism and then Chomsky, because they don't really belong to either movement. Chomsky is historically, comes out of historically syndicalist politics, but like
he does, but he like gives it up very quickly in my perception.
Right. It very quickly goes to lesser evilism. Yeah. And then Graeberism was just, it tried to have social anarchism and lifestyle anarchism are come together in a way that made no goddamn sense.
I can see that. I mean, I'm less of a follower of Graeber, but I do know that.
Think about Occupy. How is Occupy different from Taz?
He had a lot to do with Occupy, apparently. Yeah, I like certain. That's the thing, though. Like, I come across certain things of his, and I'm like, well, that's pretty good critique of the way things are. And then I follow him further, and I'm like, okay, but like, I don't know enough about the anthropology to comment on that aspect of him.
Oh, well, I think his anthropology is selective, not.
And I know that you're critical of it, but it
I
almost
would go for. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, from a distance, it almost comes off like um, the tendencies I would criticize among the primitivists, in which they're just very obsessed with like almost a romantic picture of tribal societies or something.
Right, except that it's
Um,
also tied into endorsement of what would be state monetary program, because he was also kind of a quasi MMTer.
okay.
And I don't understand how you square that circle. Like how you're like talking about MMT and like state level monetary politics, but also saying that like the occupation is the revolution and that's what we should be doing, is building these occupations as alternative forms of life everywhere. Which
Yeah.
to me is just like, it's like taking some of the worst elements of Bookchinite municipal, anarchism, and some of the worst elements of lifestyle anarchism and temporary autonomous zones, and smashing them together.
Yeah.
Like, but Graeber also was admittedly himself not very knowledgeable about pre 1960s, 1970s anarchism.
Interesting.
I mean, he said
I,
that in a couple of interviews.
I
So,
I feel like I'm more knowledgeable about it than I am about 60s and after anarchism in some ways.
well, I mean,
Because
it's because, yeah, 60s and after anarchism doesn't really have, particularly in North America, uh, outside of Bookchin, it doesn't have a lineage tied into historical anarchism at all.
yeah, and I think that's part of how the ANCAP thing became possible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Precisely because maybe a part of it is just America's culture and how hyper capitalist it could be too. But it just seems like, in my mind, yeah, anarchism is more of a European and Latin American thing if you want to be serious about it. American anarchism, like the classical individualist anarchists, even in the 19th century, they had weird, muddled ideas. Some of them were socialists of a sort, but like they also often were very anti-communist in their rhetoric, or they ended up getting into Max Stirner and like becoming weird type of individualists.
Yeah,
um,
well, individualist anarchism has also just always been slightly more popular in the United States for reasons that are
yes,
obvious.
yeah,
Whereas the socialist tradition in America tends to come either out of the populist movement of the late 19th century, or the utopian socialist movements like the Orionites and the Fourierites in the early 19th century. So, like,
yeah,
there was all kinds of quasi-anarchist, quasi-communist communes in the United States, from Blithedale Farm all the way to
yep,
the Oneida Collective. But like, um, there's a huge tradition of that in America, but it also tends to be, what's interesting about those is they tend to be quietistic, in that you set up your utopian community and you just like disengage from society. You don't
yes.
try to like,
In my mind, I associate that with the '60s and the hippies because there was a lot of revived ideas along those lines of, yeah, let's go have an agrarian commune in some quietist manner, separate from society.
in so much that there were ever that many people who took the hippie notion politically, because our link of the new left with hippies is kind of just a historical accident of timing. They weren't the same people for the most part. They both opposed the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
but that was it. That was really the only overlap, and that the new left was prominent from like 66 to 72, and the hippies exist from 66. Like, also we have to remember the hippies were a very short-lived movement.
yeah,
um like the hippie moments, like 68 to like probably like
71.
72,
Yeah,
73, some of
72 or
that,
73.
right. And there's
Pretty
some overlap with the new left and the yippies and people like that, but there's not a lot of it.
well. Yeah, a lot of it was on the anti-war thing, I think, and um, I guess
And
yeah,
then these people going in the communes and stuff. Yeah, I mean, that
yeah.
was, but you were as likely to go into a commune off of some weird yoga retreat as you were for political reasons. I mean, that's the other
Hmm.
thing. um
But I would just say, as far as like, I don't know, like yeah, like in my mind, like yeah, there's traditional anarchism, and some people do try to maintain that position of like something along the lines of syndicalism or anarcho-communism as it was like 100 plus years ago, undeveloped, which in a way it's more pure than the newer anarchism.
But it's also like it's cut off from his historical tradition because we have to admit
Yeah,
that it's basically revivalist.
and
Like,
I was gonna say there is another end of it where it's like, okay, it's like, is this backwards looking? Yeah, I do have that thought where it's like, is this actually conservative and backwards looking? Because you're trying to revive a historical. You're obsessed with people from the 19th century, and like your whole, and you're trying to revive ideas from the 19th century that might be partially outmoded, and trying to apply them to today. That's a thought that occurs to me with classical anarchism, um, especially with regard to Proudhon in some ways, especially the more
yeah,
abstract, like
I don't understand. Like, I admit that the Proudhonist tradition has to be admitted as part of classical anarchism, but it's so different than the Bakuninist or the Malatestian or the Duranty or
it's kind of a vague start because of the fact that his involvement in politics was unanarchistic.
right. And the other fact is like it's the form of classical anarchism that is recuperable to markets,
It
but
is. It's true.
um although theoretically syndicalism is too. I mean,
True.
that's the thing. Like, you could be like you could think that markets, if everything was a workers co-op, would still be okay, I guess. That's
Yeah.
But all these things to me seems, I mean, I remember the birth of, do you remember the Bhaskar Sankara article in Dissent magazine from like 2008? It was a
Hmm,
critique mostly of Naomi Klein.
I'm not sure.
About anarcho-liberalism, about the liberals who would use anarchist rhetoric and anarchist morality, but would always vote for the Democratic Party and didn't really have a systemic view of the world, and they were Keynesians and shit. Like
Interesting.
their economics were Keynesian, and
Because
um,
I mean that could be said in more recent years that happened under the Biden administration during the height of the pandemic and the BLM protests, in which all of a sudden the liberal establishment to some degree and to some effectiveness actually co-opted anarchist rhetoric, and some anarchists went along with it.
yeah. Well, I mean, the using abolish the police to talk about one trying to
Yes,
abolish the police without abolishing
that's a
capitalism,
big
which was a
one.
dumb idea, but then uh safetifying it by making it defund the police, which I was like,
Yep.
that's not what abolish means.
And then defund the police became like, let's make them more like social workers.
Right. Um and I mean, we saw a lot of that in the late aught teens slash early Biden administration. I think about another one was abolish ICE, where the
Hmm.
anarchists and the Marxists using it meant one thing, and the liberals who picked it up meant put immigration authority back in the alcohol
Yeah.
tobacco and firearms. That's all they meant.
Yeah.
Um, and there was this tendency. But what I find interesting, what I was going to bring up to you is it's post Bernie. It's hard for me to tell the difference between the Bhaskar Sankara social democrats who critique the Dems but are also in them, and the anarcho liberals like
Yeah.
Vosh. Like,
It's
I
very
can't
true.
see the difference.
And I
Like,
mean, it's relevant to bring up Chomsky because I also, when I was first getting into anarchism, like 15 plus years ago, at first I was an ANCAP and ended up moving leftward. I pretty much became some sort of ANCOM somewhere along the line in my um, critiques of markets. But in other case, you would encounter people I would call Chomskyans, and it was the Chomskyan style of anarchists. And it was kind of a weird scene that I never was part of because it felt like a lot of them, yeah, they kind of associated with syndicalism, but it was also like they all adopted a liberal pragmatist position at the end of the day. And it did push this question of like, well, Chomsky, and some of the more individualist anarchists actually had valid criticisms of the Chomskyans of like as fake anarchists because it was like, well, you guys just function as social democrats basically. So what differentiate? And then on the other hand, you observe these people who they might even frame themselves as Marxists or something, but it ends up being the Michael Harrington version of being a Marxist, which becomes something much like being a Chomskyan. So yeah, it does blur at the end of the day, doesn't it? When the anarchists follow the Chomsky path, like what's the difference between that and Richard Wolff or someone like that, really? Um,
Yeah, I mean, to me, they all converged. I mean, there's this weird way, and this is going to make a lot of different factions of my audience uncomfortable. But there's this weird way in which some of the Marxist-Leninists, some of the analytic Marxist, and some of the more liberal-leaning anarchists, although they hate each other rhetorically,
they're the same
took
thing.
the same fucking stance towards the Democratic Party in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
which was to hold your nose so that you could build a movement off of it and vote for them.
That's true.
You know,
But
I mean,
also, but
that's
also,
what the
like,
CPUSA stands for, like, ever. But yeah,
but also in terms of policy, it's like, okay, everyone ends up, kind of, okay, we want to raise the minimum wage and have the Green New Deal and raise taxes on the rich or whatever. The cliche suspects in the discourse you would suspect.
right. I
Both
mean, this is
anarchists and Marxists are pretty much advocating the same shit when it comes to that.
right. Well,
Um,
this is my whole thing. Like, I engage in I'm not an anarchist, but I engage in a lot of the anarchist tradition. One, because I think some of the critiques actually are sound, and two,
yeah, some of them are.
because when I see what people actually do, these different groups are playing similar roles in society, whether they realize it or not, despite their ideological differences in the way that they actually interact with the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
which is sort of like a lesser evil radical backstop. And I think we have to be honest. I think we saw this a lot with both social democrats and anarchist and BLM in particular,
Hmm.
and against the anti-Trump stuff, because it was like everybody was like, "Oh, we need to, it can happen here. We can do." I mean, I remember, like, I think about uh Robert Evans and that former cracked anarchist group, and they do a lot of good work in reporting that they were basically part of a popular front to get Biden elected. And I haven't seen a lot of people admitting that led us to where we are today. Now, there are a lot more Marxist Leninists who do that, but I find that kind of funny too, because believe it or not, historically they're out of step with their own tradition, because they're the tradition that invented the Popular Front in the first place.
Hmm.
Like, Marxist Leninists are the people who advocated us to, like, get in bed with FDR way back in the day. They aren't the first people who do it. That was the populists who were the first people who did it. But and they did it with a even more reactionary Democratic Party than the FDR one. But it's not. There's a long history there. I find it interesting today, though, because if we look at where the left is today, what left? I mean, there's still plenty of people who culturally identify as left wing. There's plenty of people in left orgs,
Sure.
but, like, this
It,
idea that there was a mass movement for a left candidate, that's not
no.
on the
Well,
table.
the way I've come to think of it is, yeah, the left. The left doesn't exist as a political force. It mostly exists as an online discourse, unfortunately. But it doesn't particularly exist as a political force that has an effect in the world. But yeah, you could say you could. So the death of the left discourse makes sense to me in some regards. I think some people go in weird directions with it, but I get it. It's like it's not a political force that has a real effect. It's mostly people talking to each other. A lot of them academics or just weirdos on the internet like me.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there was something about Biden in 2020 that made a lot of these groups, um like, for a while, try to. I think the first 2 years of the Biden administration was me listening to every Marxist and a whole lot of anarchists tell me that maybe we were getting something out of our deal with Biden that I did not see us getting.
Yeah.
And the railroad strike was a wake up call for some people. And then for a whole lot of people, it took Israel Palestine going the way that you would expect it to go if you know Biden's history and whatnot.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that seemed to finally wake people up, even though none of that should have been surprising.
But I've seen some really weird shit happen after Biden, and some people who at least came out of anarchism, because you see these people. I've seen people take neoconservative foreign policy stances who are like from the left libertarian camp that I used to hang around, and that like fries my brain to see. But I've seen it, and it's because I don't. It's hard to explain how or why that is. But I think part of it is that people get so scared by that people got so scared by the paleo libertarians and by Trumpism that they grasp at whatever the pragmatic option alternative would seem to be. But then they ended up pushing themselves instead of like, but they got scared by communism too. They got scared by Marxism and communism too. So the next option in their vision
They
is
see
what.
some 19-year-old Marxist Leninist on Twitter and they freak out.
Yeah,
Like,
or
go
what
ahead.
people might call, they used what people call tankies in the worst sense as their example of a Marxist. And so they're scared of the left too, and then they shrink back into a liberal pragmatist position because there's no radical alternative that seems sane to them, essentially. That's what I've seen happen with surprisingly quite a few people from the left libertarian camp. Some of them are like not really libertarians anymore too. I've seen that where it's like people are post libertarians, but instead of like me, like drifting further leftward, or instead of becoming a Trumper like some people did, their answer is to become like a centrist pragmatist of some sort.
Well, I mean, there's a long tradition of that, both with anarchist and Maoist, ironically. But like, I mean, in a way, Alex, can we blame people if they bought the Chomsky rhetoric for so long? Like, if you have to vote for the Democrats no matter what to stop the Republicans from coming to power, then it's a lot easier to do and to stomach if you convince yourself that what the Democrats are doing is actually good.
Right. It's true.
Yeah. I mean, like, um, that seems to me to be a lot of what's going on there. Is just like we're watching people uh who've told themselves, well, we have to support the lesser of two evils, and it's just a lot easier to do if you start believing, or maybe the lesser evil just isn't evil at all. Like,
Yeah.
it's a sunk cost fallacy. Um, which is, Chomsky has never been guilty of, and even some of these people that we've talked about earlier, the social democrats, are not always guilty of. But there's been a lot of tailing on 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 right wing issues. There's a lot of ignoring that, for example, on racial grievance issues, that there's basically the get rid of the settlers conundrum, which I'm like, I'm all about decolonization, but I don't know how you remove 98% of the population.
It's true.
Um, uh,
There's a practical issue there.
yes, and I don't think it's going to go the way you think if you try to either.
Yeah.
But there's also this other group that was very much in vogue until relatively recently, that was like, um, all this identitarian stuff is just to divide the working class.
You hear a lot
But
of
what
that.
we've seen is a lot of those people have just become more and more conservative outright.
It's true. Um,
So it's a hard road to rock. I mean, like, there's a lot of ways in which our actions in regards to the Democratic Party seem to have put people into um blinders. And you and I are in an interesting position, because I think you are probably less hostile to the Democratic Party than me, but we're both sort of like, what is all this about? Like, at this point,
um,
um,
I mean, I don't know that I'm less hostile, but like, um, maybe my motivations are slightly different or something. I don't
mhm.
know, but but I don't have a back history of ever supporting them. So
Right.
I'm not. I think that's part of how I differentiate myself from a lot of people on the left is that I don't have this back history of being disappointed by the Democrats because I never trusted them. Um,
I have one back history of it, and that was in 2008, and that's it. I have
yeah,
uh,
and that's what relates to the Bernie thing for me too, because like I must admit, I was tempted when Bernie first got popular. I'm like, I almost became a social democrat myself because I understand the logic. It's like, well, if we can't create the enact the radical ideas we actually want, well, I guess social democracy is the best of all possible worlds. Let's go for it. But I ended up backing off from that because I saw pretty quickly. I didn't forget what I already knew about the operation of political power. Put it that way.
mhm.
um, but it's tempting to get lulled into that. Um, of just like, well, I guess social democracy is the best of all possible worlds because what else has been tried that actually functions?
Well, I mean, arguably, a lot of Marxist
Or that
Leninists
isn't
say the
worse.
same thing about what they do. So,
That's
I mean,
true, and that's
um,
often wielded against anarchists, I guess. Of like, well, we have the one, the system that works or whatever, and you guys just have utopian fantasies or whatever.
yeah, although I would like to point out that a lot of them are a fan of the system that's no longer uh, with us. So,
That's right.
um, the only society that lasted less long was Athenian direct democracy. um, but I really think we have to really parse where we're at with a lot of this stuff, because it seems to me that I don't know where this I let this be our last thought for this episode, and I'm gonna have you back on later. But where do you think these people are gonna go if Harris R. Trump wins? Because I don't know. A lot of people are telling me we're gonna go back. We're gonna see the Trump, era of pushback that you saw in 2016, and I'm not saying that's impossible, but I don't currently see it. And I also think if somehow Harris wins, what does the left learn from all this? Maybe nothing. Like,
I mean, a lot of the discourse shows that the left already has learned nothing, I guess, and I fear it will be a repeat of the Obama era, basically, if she wins.
mhm.
If you catch my drift, I mean, I see people forgetting what the foreign policy critique of 15, 20 years ago was all over the place,
Well, I
including
mean,
people, including people who style as anarchists, which is weird to me.
you and I are living in a time where we're seeing a Cheney Harris
Yes.
unity tour, which is
Well, this is what I
like
mean. Like, it already was happening that the neoconservatives were joining with the Democrats, but now it's come full circle. Yeah, once you have Dick Cheney and joining with the Democrats, it's like, whew. But the problem is that the way that liberals talk about it is like they think it's a good thing. They're like, well, Trump is so bad that he scared Dick Cheney into joining us. They don't see the other side of it, which is like you guys became more like Dick Cheney. Um, so
right.
it's
Which, to be fair, they always kind of were, but
yeah,
um,
but it
I
became
mean,
more like full circle to me, I guess.
but they
Of
used
just
to
like,
be ashamed of it.
yeah, and now it's full.
Like,
Now it's full circle and out in the open. And it's like, well, I guess the neoconservative establishment and the Democrats have joined at the hip. But if you were someone who keenly paid attention to politics 20 years ago, you should be alarmed by this. And I'm seeing people who are not alarmed by it. They're like taking it as a good, that's the spin of it of the pro-Democrat establishment or whatever. It's like, oh, Trump is that bad that Dick Cheney joined us. They don't get it at
right.
all.
And Trump is so bad that Richard Spencer became a Biden endorser. I mean,
Yeah,
um, so I
but yeah,
find this all sort of ridiculous, to be quite frank.
it's disconcerting. But yeah, in my mind, the choice right now is between a narcissist who just takes over the entire political discourse for the purposes of their own personal grievances, and a Democratic Party that has like fully absorbed both Reaganism and neoconservatism. So it's like, okay, we just need to recognize that and be honest about it as like a square one.
I guess what I would ask you as a kind of final question about this is where do you see these people going now that there is like if the Green Party doesn't reach 5%, which I don't see them in a month being able to catch up all the ground of Nader in 2000, and that's the biggest vote the Green Party ever had, and that was only like
So you're talking
2.7% or something like that.
so you're
Like,
talking what exists of the ostensible left opposition, if you will.
right? Where do they go? Where do the left and the Democratic Party go? Do they just admit to themselves they're not left wing anymore? I mean, like
I think
because
some of them might.
one of the things I have been wondering is if like we just won't admit that like a whole lot of people have left-wing cultural issues, but like in the late 90s, early aughts, they actually have given up on any other progressive left vision. So they're just like, yeah, well, gay marriage, but and gender autonomy or whatever, but that's it. Like,
There is a lot of that.
I mean, we're not even talking about BLM anymore. Basically, if you didn't make your tenure track position or your NGO and between 2019 and 2021, even that ship has sailed. So, like, where are these people going to go? Where do you think?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer for. I do think, yeah, as you hint at, some people might come to admit that it's like, well, I guess I'm not on the left, and anymore or whatever, or here's why I'm leaving the left. I think a lot of people will choose to charge on, and it'll continue to be an online discourse. But what they have to put their energy in, I have no fucking idea.
Well, and to me, a lot of them actually, frankly, do a lot of things. Like, if I'm completely honest, I think a lot of them are only culturally left wing at this point.
I mean,
Anyway,
I get what you're saying, and I run into that with people a lot. It feels like with people who like I kind of gel with politically, but I get the sense that being culturally left wing takes precedence over everything. And it's kind of weird because like I've actually pushed back against economic reductionism before, but I do see the other side of the coin where there is kind of a cultural reductionism that's in vogue. Or maybe not
yeah.
even in
Oh, I
vogue,
am.
but just like
Go
taking
ahead.
over people's minds.
I am not a class reductionist in that I don't think social class is the only thing that matters to politics, but I am
Hmm.
a class premises in that I think social class explains the most things about where people are. Not all of it,
Hmm.
because there's divisions within the social class and
You think it has more? You think it has the most explanatory power?
right. I would actually put in this order class, gender, and then race, like in my
Actually,
order of
that makes sense to me because gender is more broad than race. Actually,
right. I mean,
um,
with the exception of some key groups and uh, foreign policy, um, is your anti-imperialism positive or negative? And by that I mean I don't mean like is it bad? That's not what I mean with negative. I mean, is your anti-imperialism just against U.S. empire? In which case, you're an ally, but that's not a substance of politics. I've even
mhm.
pointed out that like being for genocide liberation is actually not a politics in and of itself because the genocide is solved one way or another. That doesn't tell you anything about what you do to stop it from happening again, and to build up people beyond that. So like if
Yeah.
you're like I'm not gonna like if you're a single issue voter on genocide, more power to you. I'm not gonna tell you anything. Like do that. But that's not the same thing as having a coherent political vision
That's
for how you
true.
get out of imperialism or whatever. I mean, so it's like
Eh,
necessary but not sufficient.
And I guess in relation to your question, though, so there is this like abundance, if you want to call it that, of people who are like very invested in foreign policy, especially with regard to Israel. But yeah, I don't know what place they have to go though, because
Right.
obviously, like, they're all anti-Harris, or at least, they're cynical. Maybe some of them are holding their nose and voting for her,
Well, I
but
mean, we know that a whole lot of people are going to hold their nose and vote for her because,
yeah,
frankly, the majority of Democrats are not happy. I mean, a poll after poll indicates the majority of Democrats are not happy about the Harris and Biden uh, supporting of the Israel-Palestine question, but they
yep,
also don't consider it an important enough issue domestically to be the thing they vote on.
it's true.
Um, or they think that maybe Harris is going to live up to her rhetoric where she says, I believe we're working towards a ceasefire, as Biden has said for a year, despite the fact that everything we found leaked out of that administration indicates that that is a complete and total lie and they don't intend it.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it seems like the the rationalization for voting for Harris is the way I've seen some people describe it, even, and it kind of makes sense in some ways to me, but I still think that it's flawed, or that there's problems with it. But they seem to think that it's like tr- voting for Harris will stop Trump from monopolizing American politics. And by monopolizing American politics, I mean, like, his presence just, it does seem to derail American politics into just being about him and his personal grievances. And um, I think a lot of people they just want to be done with Trump, not even on account of like policy issues or anything, but because of what his posture is in relation to the political system at this point, which is as someone who like disrupts the whole fucking system so that we can't even operate to get anywhere. So it almost seems as if it's like, even among some people who are the would-be left opposition, they're going to vote for Harris just to like not have to worry about Trump having the bully pulpit, essentially.
But that ends up with, I mean, radicals who are basically arguing for the status quo over and over and over
That's
again,
true
which is,
though. That is true. And then
um,
it does become a rationalization for the status quo.
and so I guess,
But
the
that's
thing
the
that we,
sentiment I see a lot. People are like haunted by Trump just like monopolizing the political discourse about himself, I think.
but what's fascinating to me about this is we were told we were never going to normalize Trump policies, and we normalized a shit ton of them under the
Yes,
Biden
we did.
administration.
Yeah, we did. But no one seems to want to admit that.
Like like, yes, Trump has moved well to the right of his prior immigration stance because the Democrats gave him his immigration stance. So now he wants an auto da fe of all the immigrants because where
That's
else
right.
you going to go after that?
That's right.
Like, and I've actually pointed out that, like, I don't even know that the state has the like, what he is asking for would require like a New Deal level of employment, but instead of getting people to work for building infrastructure, it's getting people to be deporters.
Hmm.
Like, that's what it would require.
And then they're also effective. They've definitely crossed into advocating for, like, you're talking about removing legal immigrants now. Like, you can't say this is just about illegal immigration. You're talking about
No,
mass deportation of legal immigrants, partly with a vague economic argument, but ultimately as a kind of nationalist and racist type thing.
yeah, I don't know. We don't have the capacity. We're down capacity of people now for what we need for the number of people in society. Given that we're also seeing the rest of the baby boomers are leaving the market, and these are not the baby
True.
boomers who are have good pensions. These are the baby boomers who have 401ks,
Mm.
and having, like, who's gonna, like, we have doctor shortages now, we have teacher shortages now, we have major manufacturing sector shortages now despite automation. Like, I'm not arguing that, we should make that up on the back of, the American working class, but I'm like, who's gonna do that work?
True.
And then you add the other thing from the Trump administration is the tariffs, which were
Yeah.
already normalized in the Biden. But I'm like, that's going to lead to inflation. There's like, I don't know how that doesn't.
Yeah, and while not to sound like a free market economist, but I do think it's still true that, as a general rule, yeah, high tariff policy has adverse consequences, and it will just lead to inflation. Essentially, I think that's true. I don't think you have to be a libertarian capitalist to believe that.
No, or even a person who believes in the supply theory of inflation. Like, I'm not a
Yeah,
person who believes
I
that
don't.
money supply is the sole determiner of inflation. I don't
No,
believe that.
but
But
it
I
will
think
it will come back to bite us and effectively raise domestic prices to have high tariff policy. It just affects.
because we don't have an internal, like, we have a we do produce a ton of stuff here, people, but I know people don't realize that. But we do. But our inputs for that stuff come from other countries.
Yep.
Even when we're producing our own steel, we're sending it to other countries to be finished and then making a finished product out of it here. So like you're just adding, and you're adding tariff cost on all ends when you do that. And if you want to have a mass social fix for that, you need to like bring up whole industries very quickly with mass amounts of workers. Now, there are 10% of the male working class blue collar workers who are unemployed, but most of them are not employable. If you actually look at why they're unemployed, it's like well, some of it's hopelessness, but some of it is stuff like disability,
Okay.
um no one at home to take care of kids
There's
if they have
there's
kids.
practical
Yeah,
reasons they can't
there's
work.
practical reasons as
Yeah.
well as ideological ones. I mean, there are people who probably also just gave up, but I don't see that as being able to make up the difference. And you'd have to deal with their social problems too. And we have no one, Democrat or Republican, has put anything down to deal with the social problems or the health problems or the doctor I mean, like, I just don't see it anywhere. It's like we live in a country that's policy is pretty much based on negative partisan vibes, and that's it.
Yeah.
Um,
It does
so
feel that way.
and like, yeah, Trump has this radical agenda, Project 2025. I don't know if you think he's really going to do it. I don't. The only part of it I think he actually does is replace a whole lot of the state apparatus professionals with loyalists.
Well,
But
what's weird
again,
about it is like there's this whole
that's
anti-deep
totally legal. Go ahead.
there's this anti-deep state posture, but by the sound of it, to me, it's like he just wants to recreate the deep state in his own image anyway. So
Right.
it's like
Well,
okay.
because what else would you do? Like if you don't want to destroy the government, and I don't think Trump really wants to destroy the government, you can't
No.
destroy all the administrative stuff. You can say you're going to do it like Reagan, like every Republican has. Bush also said he was going to get rid of the education department. I mean,
That's
like,
true. It's not a new. This is not a new thing. That's very true.
it's not a new thing, and they don't mean it either. Like, which is not to say they could never deliver on it. I mean, like, but I like to point out that these people tend to deliver the stuff to their groups when their groups are when the group that they're delivering the stuff to is actually on decline. Like, for example, evangelicals in America finally getting their abortion stuff federalized the way Dobbs federalized it is also weirdly tied to a time period where evangelicals are not going to be a cultural force in the future in the same way. Even though you got a lot of like younger Zoomer and millennial men becoming religious, they're not becoming evangelical Christians.
Interesting.
So like, they're probably becoming Orthodox or Catholic Christians, or stuff like that. So it's hard for me to see where this goes. But I do think we have to deal with the fact that a lot of people got broken by Bernie.
Yes, they did.
Like, and then a lot of people got more broken by the fact that to deal with being broken by Bernie, they doubled down on trying to make excuses for the Biden administration for at least 2 years.
Yeah, I think there's a saving face rationalization logic to some of this.
Right.
And I do think, yeah, politics seems to have reduced largely to negative partisanship. And even when even when you're someone who has like critiques of the Democrats or whatever, I don't know. It's some sort of defensive logic comes in where you have to rationalize it somehow. So people end up contradicting themselves. But yeah, it's hard to know where. I'm just very cynical. It's hard to know where this goes. Um, and I'm the unpopular guy who's not voting this time around, although and many other times around. But I feel that paralysis. That's largely why I don't vote. Is I just feel that paralysis of like, well, the systemic issues aren't addressed no matter who I vote for.
Yep. I am I'm not going to say I didn't vote because I vote on local issues and I always put something down for national issues so that they don't invalidate my ballot. But I will gladly admit, and I'm not going to say what I voted for because I don't endorse people, but that I proudly threw my vote away without hesitation. And on the national level ballot, and then I voted strategically and my conscience on the local level ballot, which means I did not vote party ticket on anything.
Sure.
Which to me seems responsible, but I couldn't make myself vote for any of the two candidates that have a chance of winning. I just couldn't do it. I'm in a state that Trump is gonna carry, so you can be pissed off with me if you want, but it doesn't fucking matter. It's been weird watching Democrats start to shame people even voting their conscience in deep blue states. That's been bizarre. Because it used to be that was an accepted like thing even amongst progressive Democrats, and that's even becoming taboo. And I'm like, is that just that they know how close and insecure they are?
I don't know. At this point, I see people, you know, posting Michael Jackson "We Are the World" style local all star thing, saying vote. And that's what we're left with as far as liberal signaling, I guess. And this is coming from people who were Bernie supporters before too. So it's like, okay, so you just have inspirational messaging at this point.
Yeah. So you've gone from from Bernie to Lin-Manuel Miranda. I mean, Hamilton vision, great, lovely.
Pretty much.
I mean, and you have people like Ben Burgess saying that they've protest voted. So I mean, the world has gotten a lot weirder.
What do you mean Ben Burgess
All right, and on
protest
that
vote?
note, he said he wrote in he announced to the public that he wrote in Rashida Tlaib's name.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. Well, on that note, I think we'll end. I'll have you back on to talk about some other issues in the future. Thank you for coming on, Alex.
No problem.
People can find your work at your Substack, which will be linked.
I appreciate it. Have a good one.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.